Hey everyone, James here from Adventures Through the Mind. Now, as some of you might know, I recently attended an event in Toronto, an inaugural event called the International Death Symposium. I had actually made a video that was sponsored by them a little while back, which I'll link in the description below. But I wanted to catch up on a few things about it because a lot of people asked me after I attended, like, oh, I'm really looking forward to hearing about it and what you learned. And I think that's a good idea because I really feel like I got a lot of value out of that, and it's great to share that kind of value with you, the listeners. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about that I learned there, and I think primarily we'll start off with why I went. There's a lot of reasons why I went, one of which is that I'm going to die, so I would like to have a sense of, a sense of what the process might be like, as I haven't had a lot of great examples in my life. I haven't been with a lot of dying people throughout the course of my life. I mean, maybe more than some, but certainly less than in most traditional cultures, would provide. And so I kind of want to get familiar with that. Another thing is that I support people through hard times in a type of coaching program, in particular with psychedelic integration. So having a working understanding and getting deep knowledge from people who work with dying patients and who work as grief counselors, and this is invaluable information for me. Not only for that work, but also for the fact that I'm a community member and that at some point those skills will be called upon in the community as well. The other reason is that, as stated in the previous video that I just mentioned, is that it seems like we've got a pretty death-phobic culture here, and that it doesn't really serve us well insofar as bringing good meaning or to bringing generative meaning to the dying process. That dying in some way is a slight that nature provides to us, and that it makes sense for us to be the living as much as we can live for as long as possible and try to thwart death as long as possible, and understandably so. It's nice to live a long and happy and fulfilling life, but when it comes down to the end of the life and to the dying process, I'm not sure what that means insofar as the end of life, but when it comes to the dying process, then things get really iffy, and I wonder if we're just so focused on living all the time and really are trying to stay so far away from dying that when we land in our dying time, or when someone we care about lands in our dying time, we can't look at it, we can't see it in a way, and we can only see it through the filters of our prioritization of looking towards living for so long, and we can't seem to look upon death as a part of that because it hasn't been a part of that throughout the course of our lives. So attending an event like this seemed really valuable because it's a mark inside of Canadian culture to say, hey, let's have a really big public discussion about dying. And so in some sense, I felt like it's almost like some level of cultural activism just to attend, just to support such an event like that. So that's another reason that I felt that it made sense to go. Another is that, as I said before, I'm going to die. People I care about will die. My parents, my sibling, my friends, my grandparents, or the ones that are still alive. People I know are going to die. If I am so blessed to stay alive for a long time, then chances are, I'll witness most of my friends die and most of my family die, or like the generation, of my generation and above. And so, I mean, it makes sense, does it not, to kind of get familiar with what that might be like psychologically, emotionally, culturally, and by culturally, I also mean like interpersonally, to get a sense of what that might be like when, even though it's difficult to look at it, it's still kind of an arm's length away, because it's not someone I deeply care about, and it's not me actually dying. Yes, of course, it hurts and it's scary, and there's pain and there's fear and there's distress that comes up, and there's grief and there's sadness. But there's still a knowing that it's like, yes, although I'm touching the inevitable, I'm not actually dying right now, and someone I deeply care about isn't dying right now. And so it's a little bit easier to some degree, and it seems to make sense to get familiar with it then, prior to when it will be eventually thrust upon me. And I think this is a good point to consider for all of you as well. And this talk about culture is something that I find was a relevant theme inside of the event, which is especially with a couple speakers like Caitlin Doty, and then there was also a panel of different people talking about the art of dying. And it seemed clear that it's like ours here in the dominant culture of North America, we'll say, is very death phobic and does some weird shit that doesn't seem to make any sense, like when you look at it, as to why we would do it, because it doesn't actually seem to be positive in any way, from how we bury and conduct our bodies, to how we conduct our funeral services, to how we deal with grief and grieving, and how we attend to the experience of dying and to dying people. I mean, it's not terrible, of course, but it's not really bringing generative meaning to a lot of things. And that there are other cultures that have really different ways of doing things, and there are people who have a sense of cultural religious certainty about what happens after death, and that they don't see a reason to fear or distress. They see it like coming home. They see it like returning to the next phase, see it as life after death. And as much as that feels ridiculous to me because of my so-called secular tendencies or sensibilities, I mean, that's something that's, I think, really interesting to consider, is that, not everybody's confused and lost. And furthermore, furthermore, there are other cultures that have extremely effective ways of helping people go through the grieving process. There was a man, Kevin Toulis, I'll leave a link below to a BBC Ideas video that he did, that talked about the complexity and beauty of the Irish wake and the funeral, and how there are all these cultural things that they do that are like psychological tricks to support the bereaved in the grieving process, and the whole community in the grieving process. And yeah, and it was really both beautiful and then also really sad, because it's like, wow, that's so gorgeous, and I will not experience that. I am very unlikely to know that is being experienced for my dying body, or to my dyingness, or for the people who are left behind grieving my death. And I am unlikely to experience something that, I mean, tragic and sad, but beautiful for anyone that I care about. And that in and of itself is sort of difficult, because it's like, what do we do now? What do we do as a culture, as groups of people, to ensure that this, that something better can come from us? And it might not be for me, and it might not be for the other people in my community that are doing it. Maybe it'll be for generations later, after the culture that we build now by, standing up in the face of the degenerative, dominant culture of North America and saying, no, we won't, pump the bodies full of chemicals. And actually, I'll talk about that in a second. No, we won't do this the way that you're telling us to do it. We're going to do it in a way that's most meaningful. So a couple more things that I think would be relevant to talk about, and then I'm going to end with some questions that were sort of presented during the conference that I'll present to you to consider. The body. So one of the speakers was Caitlin Doty. She runs a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician, which I'll link below, and she gave an excellent talk about what we do with the bodies of our dead loved ones here in North America, and how strange it is. For example, the concept that we take the body, that we're told as family that it's illegal to take the body to transport the body, or to have it in your home, that the body is dirty or it's like toxic. And that basically the funeral home and the funeral directors need to have everything. They take care of everything for you because it's difficult and it's dangerous. But in doing so, almost completely remove any actual meaningful action on behalf of the bereaved with their dead loved one, except for maybe signing forms and picking flowers. There's even to the point where the body isn't even lowered into the grave by the loved ones. You just, slowly back away, and sometime later you see them going down into the ground. And that this isn't really true. The body isn't toxic, and it's not illegal to transport the body. It's not illegal to have the body of your loved one in a home, to have the wake in a home, to have the funeral in a home. And it's certainly not illegal to bury the body, to dig the hole yourself. I mean, you have to be in appropriate places, but to dig the hole yourself and with your community. And there's a real psychologically meaningful, difficult, I imagine, of course, but psychologically meaningful action of being the ones to put the body under. It's also not necessary to completely pump the body full of a toxic preservative chemical and then lock it in a steel vault inside of the ground. I mean, sometimes even with cement to ensure it stays there. It's that's really unnecessary, because the body, I just it doesn't even make any sense why we would do that. Does it not make more sense to just wrap the body in, say, a shroud or in a simple wooden coffin and bury it somewhere without any preservative chemicals, so that the earth naturally decomposes the body? And at some point you could even reuse that gravesite because the body is, decomposed. So that was also something that she talked about. And for me, this comes up and it's wow. So what would I want? And from what I saw, I think I have a sense of what I'd want, which is for my body not to be handled by the hospital and not to be handled by a funeral director, but to be handled by my loved ones. And this is going to sound kind of intense, but it is a practice, which is to have my body brought back to, my home, or we'll see where I am at that time in my life, but to a home where my body is washed and treated with oils by the people who I love and who I care about, and put on display in the main room, and have everyone who ever cared to come say hello and say goodbye to me just come by during the wake, and be with the body in the room and say goodbye and drink food and celebrate and cry, and for my body to be put in the ground untreated, so that it can, it's already bad enough, the amount of toxic bullshit I've put into the earth simply by being alive in the modern world. Why wouldn't I want to try to some sense of not having my body continue to be a burden, for decades and decades to come? This is heavy stuff to think about, and I'm kind of going off on it like it's just ideas, and understandably so. That's kind of the mind state that I'm in. But when I was at this conference and thinking about these things and thinking about, the bodies of my loved ones and how they're scattered, they're scattered all over North America. My ancestors, my the family that have gone before me, they're all scattered over North America. That our bodies don't lay in similar places. I don't have a clan burial site, and chances are I won't be buried in the same place as the rest of my family, because I'll want to be put in a green burial site. So there's a lot to consider there. The next thing I want to talk about that I felt was relevant was about grief. Now, there's this man speaking, Samit Kumar, a doctor, and he was talking about grief, and he made a couple comments that I felt was really incredible, actually. That we have been, as a species, burying our dead for a very, very long time, like our wild progenitors, our progenitors to even Homo sapien, were burying their dead, which means they were having funeral arrangements. And if they're having a funeral, that meant that they were really deeply affected by their dead, which meant they were grieving. So that means grief has been around for so long that it existed before we even had language, which is a suggestion that he made, is that it's so difficult to talk about grief and to communicate grief and to talk inside of it because it exists before language. That grief is older than language, and that really struck me. Another thing that he talked about was these three principles about grief that are misunderstood. One of which is that grief is natural, grief is cyclical, and grief is pain. Grief is natural in the sense that it is a natural part of who we are, and it emerges and it comes and it passes through us and it rises and it falls and it rises and it falls, and it's not pathological to be grieving. You know, it's not anything wrong with you if you're grieving. It's something that's natural and it's beautiful. And it's also interesting for him to talk about, if we look at the way dominant culture of North America, my words, deals with the natural world, and then we look at the way the culture deals with grief, there's a real similarity about how we conduct ourselves. The next one is that grief is cyclical. And his point here was very interesting because instead of saying, we in North America, we have this sense that time is very linear. It goes from the past to the future, and it's sort of like an upward climbing, story of ascent. And that what was in the past stays in the past. It doesn't repeat itself. We just go on forever into the future. And I mean, I don't think he made any particularly metaphysical claims about the nature of time, but he did suggest that grief is not like that. Grief is cyclical. Grief comes back and it comes around, and either it's on or it's off. Over time, the acute grief of like the moment, sort of fades for a time, but then acute grief comes up again. That's just how the body grieves, that it comes in cycles, and that this misunderstanding about grief being cyclical or not being cyclical comes with a misunderstanding of how to support people with grief. Because, at 4 or 5 years, it's like nobody wants to hear about you grieving for the person that you care about anymore. Like it's been 4 years, you should be over it by now. As though it is just an event to get over, rather than a defining moment in your life that alters and shifts and inspires who you'll be for the rest of your life. Finally, he said grief is pain. And this really struck. It's not just like grief. I mean, some people, I don't know, they think feelings, they confuse them with stories in our head about our interpretations of the context that gave rise to the feelings. But feelings are physical. They're in the body. That's where they exist. They exist right here, right now in the body. And that grief is pain. It is a type of pain. And pain, of course, and I'm going deep into what he's trying to say here, or at least, reiterating as best I can, is that, yes, pain does trigger us to let us know that something's wrong, but we're not wrong for feeling pain. And he made this quote, or he presented this quote, because he gave a perspective of like mindfulness and Buddhism and applying that approach to grief. And he used this quote, which is, pain cannot be healed by running from it. Grief pain can render our hearts broken open. By managing the stress of the pain, we can heal ourselves with our open hearts, but only for today. And he suggests that, it's leaning in to the pain. And this is a Stanislav Grof quote, or a paraphrase, which is something like, the fullest expression of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. And so he suggests here too, the poison is the antidote. When grief comes up and that pain is there, the thing that resolves the grief is the grief, if you can lean into it. And he says we can circumambulate the moment of acute grief the rest of our lives, and that is natural. All right, so I'm going to finish with a couple of questions that I'll encourage you to think about and maybe talk about with other people, or you could comment your thoughts in the description below this video. One of which is, it is our responsibility as the living to care for the dying, but what is our responsibility to the dead? The other, and this one really called an interesting question into my head, is, what music do you want playing when you're dying? For me, I immediately felt Pale Ravine by Deaf Center, which I'll link below. And if I can get the rights, I'll have it playing in the video right now. So that's it. Thank you for watching the video, and thanks to the International Death Symposium for what they did there this past weekend in late September of 2018. Like the one before was sponsored. This one isn't sponsored. This is just me, talking about it because I feel like it's relevant and interesting information to talk about. And I think it's really important information for us to come together and to talk with each other about, because it is extremely relevant. We're all going to grow old, and we're going to die, or we're going to die before growing old. That's also a possibility. But I think it's just so important that we talk to each other about it, and talk critically and talk vulnerably. So I hope that this video lands well for you, and feel free to express yourself in the comments below. Thanks for liking this video, and if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so on Patreon. That is linked below as well. So thanks so much, and I will see you at another time. Bye.